Welcome to the research desk.
We are examining a rather fundamental disturbance in modern cultural history today.
We really are. The central question we are exploring, which is drawn directly from the historical and theoretical record, is this: when does a painting stop being a painting and become an event?
Right, and this is not just a simple question of artistic categorization or, a squabble over museum labels.
No, not at all. It is a profound inquiry into how the very nature of authorship, of value, of physical labor, and the modern economy of experience underwent a radical transformation.
To really get to the bottom of this, we have to look back to a specific, almost microscopic moment in time. A moment when audiences started seeing not just a static image hanging on a gallery wall, but, a living, breathing body at work behind it. Oh, the post-war boom.
Yes. We are right in the middle of it. The middle class is exploding. The atomic age has brought this entirely new kind of existential anxiety.
And the cultural center of the world is violently shifting, right? From Paris to New York.
It is. And in August of that year, Life magazine, which at the time was the undisputed arbiter of mainstream American taste, published something incredible. This magazine was sitting on the coffee tables of millions of homes.
And they published an article that would become a defining flashpoint in American art history?
They really did. They featured a 2.5-page spread on an artist, and they posed a highly provocative, seemingly audacious question to the general public. The headline read simply, "Is he the greatest living painter in the United States?"
Which is a massive claim. And the subject, of course, was Jackson Pollock.
Jackson Pollock. The photographs showed a rugged, cigarette-smoking man from Wyoming standing in front of an absolute, chaotic swirl of densely dripped paint.
It was completely baffling to the average reader.
Baffling. So we have to ask the rhetorical question. How does an artist go from producing an arrangement of paint on a canvas to generating a public spectacle of this magnitude?
Well, that is the core tension we are looking at today.
Right. My position, the case I am championing today, is that Jackson Pollock made painting itself performative. He did not simply change how paint was applied to a surface, he turned his physical gesture, his actual bodily movement in space, into the essential content of the work.
So you are saying the canvas became a secondary artifact?
Exactly. It was merely the residual evidence of a primary theatrical action.
I have to say, I approach this from a position of profound skepticism regarding that specific narrative. I will be rigorously stress testing this thesis because the historical reality, the actual fundamental nature of what that object was in the world, matters immensely.
I welcome the stress test.
My case is that the much later performance art movement merely appropriated an energy and a conceptual methodology that still fundamentally and unavoidably belonged to the physical painted object.
So you see it as a retrospective distortion.
A massive one. To look backward from contemporary performance art, from the vantage point of the 21st century, and claim that Pollock was already functioning as a performance artist is dangerous. It dangerously conflates the private process of creation with the public intent of a performance.
But the intent changed the moment the public saw the process.
We must draw a strict, unyielding line between embodied physical labor, which has quite literally always existed in the arts, and the total dematerialization of the object.
But to understand the origin of this historical tension, we must examine the exact inflection point.
The moment the public reception of the artwork was permanently altered.
Exactly.
And that moment did not happen in a pristine gallery. It occurred in the summer of 1950.
It happened in a very specific, incredibly humble setting.
Yes, the setting was a drafty wooden barn in Springs on Long Island.
A barn, not a studio in Manhattan.
Right, a barn. The photographer and filmmaker Hans Namuth traveled out there specifically to document Jackson Pollock working in his studio. Now, Namuth did not just capture static, posed portraits of an artist looking thoughtfully at an easel.
He captured the raw action.
He filmed Pollock in the raw act of creation, and the documentation is absolutely visceral. I want you to picture the scene. Viewers of this film watch Pollock stalking around a massive expanse of raw canvas.
A canvas that has been unrolled and laid completely flat on the wooden floorboards.
Exactly. He is not standing still. He is constantly bending, pouring from cans of industrial enamel, rhythmically circling the perimeter of the canvas like a predator.
And there is that one famous sequence with the glass.
Oh, it is visually jarring. Namuth actually took a large sheet of thick glass, elevated it outdoors, and positioned himself physically beneath it, aiming his camera straight up. Pollock then proceeded to paint directly onto the glass from above.
So as the viewer, you are looking up through the glass.
Yes, and you literally watch black and white paint hurtling directly toward your eyes. You see the intense physical exertion in his face. You see the precise, rhythmic control that is completely masked as chaotic dripping.
The athleticism is just exhausting to watch.
It is the sheer, exhausting athleticism of the entire process. The general public had never seen the act of painting demystified and dramatized in quite this way before. It was an unprecedented exposure of the labor behind the illusion.
And that unprecedented exposure, that specific piece of documentation, is precisely what altered the trajectory of modern art.
You think it was that definitive?
I really do. Namuth's film did not merely offer an educational clarification of how Pollock got the paint onto the canvas. It permanently changed audience reception. It changed the psychology of how we look at art.
Okay, walk me through that psychological shift.
Well, before 1950, a painting, even a highly abstract, non-representational one like a Piet Mondrian or a Kazimir Malevich, was primarily evaluated as a composed surface. You stood in front of it and you looked at the relationships of color, the geometry of the line, and the balance of form.
All contained neatly within the physical boundary of the wooden frame.
Exactly. You were judging an end product. But after those images of Pollock dripping paint through the air circulated internationally, the entire paradigm shifted. The painting was no longer just a composed surface. It became the canvas as evidence of an encounter.
The canvas as evidence of an encounter. That is a heavy phrase.
Think about what that actually means for a second. If you walk into a room and see a shattered vase on the floor, you don't evaluate the shattered pieces of ceramic for their aesthetic composition.
No, you wonder who broke it.
Right. Your brain immediately tries to reconstruct the violent event that caused the shattering. You become a detective looking at a crime scene. That is exactly what happened to Pollock's work.
But the physical object remained.
The physical object remained, of course. It was still stretched, framed, and hung in galleries and museums. But the viewer's psychological posture had fundamentally changed. They were no longer just looking at a picture. They were deciphering a prior physical event.
Deciphering the movements.
Yes, tracing the frantic, sweeping movements of the artist's body through the arcs, the loops, and the splatters of the hardened paint. The canvas became a crime scene of creative action.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
You are taking a secondary layer of media, mediation, a documentary film, and elevating it to the primary reality of the artwork itself.
I am elevating it because the culture elevated it.
But you are suggesting that because we saw the documentary, the nature of the painting magically transformed into a performance. Let's look at the reality of those sessions in that Long Island barn. They were fiercely private studio practices.
They were private, sure.
Pollock was notoriously shy. He hated being filmed, and he actually felt that Namuth's presence deeply disrupted his flow. The making of the art was only secondarily documented.
But the documentation is what survived in the public consciousness.
There were no ticketed audiences sitting in the rafters of the barn, though. There were no structured live events. There was no established revenue stream for watching Pollock paint.
True, he wasn't selling tickets to the barn.
The fact that a documentary film dramatically changed public perception does not retroactively turn the private, solitary act of painting into a piece of performance art. The fundamental intent of the artist in that barn was to produce a durable, physical painting that would outlast the afternoon he spent making it.
But you can't separate the intent from the reception.
The documentation by Namuth was a post-production frame and device. It was marketing, essentially. If we start conflating a documentary about making a thing with the thing itself, we lose all categorical rigor. We blur the lines until every artist who has ever been photographed in their studio becomes a performance artist by default.
You raise the issue of studio practice, which actually provides the perfect entry point into the formal argument of abstraction itself.
How so?
It is exactly his violent departure from traditional studio practice that validates the performative thesis. To understand this, we must redefine our understanding of what abstraction actually sought to achieve in the mid-20th century.
It sought to remove representation.
That is what the public thought. For the longest time, the public thought abstraction was merely a negative action. The process of eliminating recognizable objects like trees or apples or faces from the picture plane.
Right, stripping it down to pure form.
But it was never just about elimination. It was an affirmative project. It was about reaching an inner, almost spiritual reality. It was an attempt to capture raw emotion, psychological force, psychic intensity, and pure rhythm.
And the Europeans had been trying to do that for decades.
Exactly. For decades, European artists tried to signify these invisible forces through perfectly straight lines, geometric shapes, or very careful, flat fields of color. But think about the logic of expression here.
Go on.
If a sweeping, carefully painted line on a canvas can theoretically represent an inner psychological force, then a sweeping arm, a falling torso, an actual, heavy, physical exertion in real space embodies that force even more directly.
Because the body is actually doing the thing it represents.
Yes, Pollock abandoned the fixed, upright easel, which had dictated the relationship between painter and canvas for centuries. He placed the raw canvas flat on the floor.
Which changed his physical relationship to it entirely.
By doing this, he completely destroyed the traditional orientation of top, bottom, left, and right. He physically stepped out onto the canvas, entering the arena of the painting with his whole body.
And you see this as the leap into performance.
Because of this massive shift in physical orientation, the line of paint ceased to be just a line. It became choreography made visible. The gesture was no longer representing an action taking place in the artist's mind, it was the action.
But it still resulted in a static object.
The painting merely caught the residue of the performance as it happened, and we can look to sociology and anthropology to clearly explain exactly how the shift operates on the human mind.
You mean Pierre Bourdieu?
Yes, if we look at the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's analysis of cultural production, he demonstrates that the social position, the mythology, and the persona of the artist become entirely inseparable from the value of the physical work.
The myth of the creator imbues the creation.
Precisely. Furthermore, if you look at the anthropologist Alfred Gell, he wrote extensively on the theory of art and agency. He explains how objects are read by human societies as vessels of makerly action.
Makerly action. That sounds a bit academic. Can you ground that?
Let me put that in real-world terms. Think about the difference between holding a factory-produced synthetic blanket and a heavy, slightly imperfect sweater that your grandmother hand-knit for you over 3 months.
Well, obviously the grandmother's sweater has sentimental value.
But why? When you look at the hand-knit sweater, you don't just see yarn. You see the hours. You feel the presence of the person who made it. You see the physical labor suspended in the object.
So the object points backward to the person.
The object acts as an index, a physical pointer, back to the human agency that produced it. Once Pollock's dynamic full-body method became highly visible to the American public through Namuth's lens, the canvas could no longer be viewed as merely a finished, inert thing.
It became charged.
It became highly charged with human agency. It was suspended in a state of potential energy, exactly as if the sweat, the gravity, and the physical exertion of his body remained permanently trapped and vibrating inside the enamel paint.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the fundamental distinction between a line of paint and a human body?
What do you mean? They are both vehicles for expression.
The argument that the human body in motion is the purest, highest form of abstraction relies on a deeply flawed and highly romanticized premise. The human body is never purely abstract.
Well, no, it is physical.
It is impossibly, stubbornly concrete. It is culturally saturated from the moment it enters a room. Every single body carries immediate, unavoidable social meaning.
Meaning that goes beyond just form and motion.
Exactly. It is gendered, it is racialized, it is socialized, it is subject to historical discipline, to aging, and to profound vulnerability. A sweeping line of black enamel paint looping across a canvas does not have a gender.
But the body making it does.
A body performing a physical action in front of a camera always does. When you put a body forward as the primary medium of the art, you are instantly dealing with representation, not abstraction. You are asking the audience to look at a specific human being with all their specific cultural baggage moving through space.
But that doesn't negate the makerly action.
Furthermore, you invoke Alfred Gell and the concept of makerly action and trapped agency. Let's look at the history of art. All art involves bodies. All art involves intense, sometimes agonizing physical labor.
Sure, art is hard work.
Think of the Renaissance fresco painters. These men spent years of their lives climbing precarious multi-story wooden scaffolds. They lay on their backs in the freezing damp of chapels, straining their necks to the point of permanent physical deformity, just to paint wet plaster onto ceilings.
Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel.
Exactly. Think of classical sculptors. They engaged in brutal, backbreaking, dangerous physical labor to chisel monolithic blocks of solid marble into delicate folds of fabric.
But that labor wasn't the point of the piece.
Or think of master calligraphers in East Asia who spend a lifetime learning to move their entire bodies with exquisite, rhythmic, highly disciplined control just to produce a single perfect ink character on paper. The mere fact that physical labor is required, or even that the labor is highly rhythmic, intense, and dramatic, does not automatically convert the act of making into a performance artwork.
You don't think so?
Not at all. The labor of production is the absolute prerequisite for the object, not the object itself. To cross the historical threshold into true performance art, the act itself must become the intended primary artwork. It cannot simply be the dramatic, sweaty means by which a final artifact is produced and sent to a gallery.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how that labor is actually consumed by the public.
How so?
The intense labor of the fresco painter in the Sistine Chapel or the sculptor hacking away at marble was historically obscured from the public.
That is true. They hid the scaffolding.
The patron in the audience only ever saw the finished ceiling or the polished statue. The final object deliberately hid the sweat, the sawdust, and the scaffolding. What radically shifted with abstract expressionism in the mid-20th century, and what absolutely solidifies my position today, is how the messy process of creation actively entered the commodity form.
You are saying the process became the product.
The process itself became what the audience was buying. We can clarify this by looking at a broader economic migration of value. Let's use a celebrity chef comparison.
Okay, culinary history. I am with you.
Before the era of mass media and television, high-end restaurant chefs, even the absolute masters of the craft, were largely hidden artisans, locked away in the back.
They toiled behind closed wooden doors in the extreme heat of a 19th century kitchen. The wealthy patrons sitting out in the dining room with their crystal glasses only interacted with the final product, the perfectly plated meal.
The labor was entirely invisible.
The brutal labor of chopping, searing, and plating was entirely invisible. But then culture shifted, beginning with figures like Julia Child in the 1960s, who brought the physical process, the mistakes, and the mess of the kitchen directly into the American living room.
The kitchen slowly became a stage.
Eventually, you trace that timeline forward, and you arrive at modern culinary culture. You get figures like Gordon Ramsay, who turn the intense psychological pressure, the rapid physical motion, the aggressive verbal commands, and the specific physical technique of cooking into a core part of the product being consumed. So the diner isn't just paying for the food anymore.
Think about the modern diner at a high-end chef's table or an open-concept Michelin star restaurant. They still receive a tangible, beautifully plated piece of food. The physical object remains.
But the price tag is much higher.
But the massive economic and cultural premium they are paying, the reason the dinner costs $400 instead of $40, is for the imagined theater of the kitchen. They are paying to witness the signature technique, the stress, the heat, and the myth of the creator working right in front of them.
And you think Pollock was doing the same thing?
Jackson Pollock's canvases began to function in exactly the same way within the mid-century art market. The myth-making circulation of his body in action, his highly publicized performative labor, amplified the market value of the static objects he produced.
Amplified the value, yes.
He was no longer just selling an abstract composition of black and white lines. He was selling the physical prowess, the danger, and the narrative of the wild event that produced it.
We must rigorously stress test this economic theory because the actual literal mechanisms of the art market at that time simply do not support the conclusion that process had superseded the object.
Why not? The prices went up because of his fame.
However much media mythology, Life magazine spreads, and the romantic theater of production added perceived value or mystique to the paintings, the abstract expressionists were not selling process in any structured, literal, or legally binding way.
But they were selling the story of the process.
The supply chain of artistic value remained brutally rigid and entirely traditional. The supply chain goes like this. The artist creates a physical painting. The dealer exhibits and sells the physical painting. The collector acquires and insures the physical painting. You could not buy the act independently of the artifact.
That is a fair point about the legal structure of the sale.
You could not invest in the process. There was no financial mechanism to collect the performance. If that drafty barn in Sutton Springs burned down overnight and the canvases were destroyed, the economic value was instantly reduced to zero, regardless of how beautifully or athletically Jackson Pollock had moved his body the day before.
The physical asset was still required.
The art world continually reinvents and fiercely protects the physical object because objects remain operationally useful for conservation, for exclusive ownership, and for the accumulation of capital.
You can insure an action.
You cannot put a physical gesture in a bank vault. Furthermore, you brought up the idea of the body earlier, which forces us to look away from economics and confront the political reality of what happens when the literal human body is foregrounded as the medium.
The political reality?
Yes, as I said earlier, the body is not a neutral artistic instrument. Once you claim the body itself is the work, questions of power, control, and identity immediately dominate the interpretation. To see this clearly, we have to look at the French artist Yves Klein.
The Anthropometries.
His Anthropometries from the late 1950s, just a few years after Pollock's peak. Klein orchestrated elaborate, highly publicized events in Paris. He would invite an elegant, dressed-up audience to a gallery.
It was very theatrical.
He would have young, nude female models completely covered in a patented, vivid ultramarine pigment known as International Klein Blue. Klein would then verbally direct these nude women to press, roll, and drag their paint-covered bodies across large sheets of white paper or canvas spread on the floor or the wall.
While the audience watched.
And while this was happening, a small string orchestra would be playing a single, continuous, monotonous chord for 20 minutes. Klein himself stood back from the canvas, fully dressed in formal evening wear, a tuxedo and white gloves, acting entirely as the director.
He never actually touched the paint himself.
He never touched the paint. This is a crucial, undeniable evolution in your historical timeline of action painting. But we have to look very closely at what is actually happening in that room.
What is happening in that room is the exact sharpening of the principle I have been describing since we started.
You see it as a continuation?
Absolutely. Painting had definitively, undeniably become an event of physical contact. Yes, the artist's direct gesture was displaced. Klein himself did not physically touch the paint or the paper, but the ritual of production became paramount.
But look at the ritual itself.
The audience gathered in that Parisian gallery did not simply walk in, sip champagne, and contemplate a finished, dry blue surface on the wall. They witnessed a live, unfolding operation. The very making of the mark became a collective, real-time experience shared by everyone in the room.
But does that validate the action painting thesis?
It proves that the trajectory stemming from Pollock's floor-bound canvas was inevitably, irreversibly moving toward the full theatralization of the painting process. The object was becoming the byproduct of the event.
It proves nothing of the sort regarding pure abstraction. Rather, it brutally exposes the ideological blind spot in treating the human body as just another giant paintbrush.
Ideological blind spot?
The Anthropometries are not a celebration of abstract movement. They are a masterclass in the choreography of gendered control. Look at the power dynamics.
Well, there is certainly a director-model dynamic.
The female bodies are entirely stripped of their individual agency. They are rendered anonymous, literally coded in uniform blue color, and physically manipulated under the strict verbal instructions of a fully clothed, authoritative male author, standing safely at a distance.
He is treating them as tools.
The body in this context becomes the paintbrush, the silent model, the passive medium, and the public spectacle all at exactly the same time. This completely shatters the romantic illusion that bodily motion in art is merely choreography made visible in some pure, elevated formalist sense.
It complicates it, certainly.
To see the absolute terminus of this problem, to see how the body fundamentally breaks the rules of abstract painting, we must look a few years later to Yoko Ono's 1964 performance, Cut Piece.
That is a very different kind of performance.
Exactly. Ono sat completely motionless on a stage at Carnegie Recital Hall in New York. She was wearing a nice suit. She placed a pair of sharp tailorist scissors on the floor in front of her.
And she invited the audience up.
She invited audience members to come up onto the stage, one by one, and cut away pieces of her clothing. There is no paint in this room. There is no canvas. But more importantly, it absolutely shatters the idea of the body as a vehicle for pure abstraction.
Because it is entirely about real-world interaction.
The immense, terrifying power of Cut Piece does not rely on formal visual principles like line, color, or composition. It relies entirely on activating the real-world dynamics of human vulnerability, aggression, spectatorship, and consent.
It gets incredibly tense very quickly.
As audience members came up and cut away larger and larger pieces of her clothing, the tension in the room became agonizing. It highlights the massive critical blind spot in viewing Pollock's mythic, masculine, forceful agency in the barn as a universal standard for embodied art.
It is a totally different form of agency.
A still, seated woman silently inviting the destruction of her boundaries by strangers is not politically or conceptually equivalent to a rugged male painter aggressively circling a canvas in the privacy of his own studio. The meanings diverge at the very root level of identity before any artistic action even takes place.
I see your point about the inescapable politics of the body. But if the introduction of the literal human body brings all of these incredibly complex social and political variables into the equation, if the canvas is actually holding the artist back from exploring those real-world dynamics, we have to ask a fundamental rhetorical question.
Which is?
What happens when artists realize this? What happens when the object disappears entirely?
You mean when the painting is totally gone?
What happens when the canvas is finally permanently removed from the room? We find the historical answer in the late 1950s with the American artist Allan Kaprow.
Ah, the happenings.
Kaprow was deeply influenced by the action painters. He looked very closely at what Pollock did. He understood the implications of the body in space, and he took it to its logical, absolute conclusion. In 1959, Kaprow staged a groundbreaking piece titled 18 Happenings in 6 Parts at the Rubin Gallery in New York.
He totally transformed the gallery space, right?
He completely transformed the space. The gallery was divided into 3 distinct rooms using semi-transparent plastic sheets. The audience was not allowed to simply stand at a distance, sip wine, and look at art on the walls.
They were given instructions.
Specific written instructions, and were strictly required to move through the rooms at specific timed intervals. In these dimly lit rooms, performers carried out carefully scored but completely mundane actions.
What kind of actions?
Yes, some of them painted on canvas, but they also squeezed fresh oranges into glasses, they played records, they silently swept the floor with brooms, and they made seemingly random, disjointed sounds.
Squeezing oranges as art.
When the event ended, there was no master image to carry home. There was no single focal point. You couldn't buy the orange peels. This is action painting with the object officially demoted.
Demoted, yes, but still present in fragments.
Kaprow realized that if the true value of Pollock's work was the energetic event of its making, then you no longer needed the residual painting at all. You could just score the event itself. This was not a random invention out of nowhere. It was the direct, undeniable continuation of Pollock's legacy.
It fully crossed the threshold.
It fully crossed the threshold from a static object to an immersive, temporary experience.
You bring up Kaprow and the chaos of the happenings, but to truly understand the depth of the ontological break between painting and performance, we have to jump ahead to the ultimate conclusion of this trajectory.
Where does it end up?
We have to look at Marina Abramovic's monumental retrospective. The artist is present, held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2010.
That is a massive leap forward in time.
But conceptually, it is the absolute terminus. For 736 hours, extending over nearly 3 agonizing months, Abramovic sat entirely motionless in a wooden chair in the museum's massive atrium.
Just sitting?
She did not speak. One by one, day after day, visitors were invited to sit in an empty chair directly opposite her and simply share silent, unbroken eye contact for as long as they wished.
It was incredibly emotional for the participants.
Some people sat for 2 minutes, some sat for an entire day. Many wept uncontrollably. There was no physical action, there was no paint, there was no orange squeezing, and there was certainly no physical object being produced for the gift shop or the gallery system.
Just the presence.
Exactly. Kaprow and Abramovic actually prove my case, the bear case, definitively. Abramovic's grueling act of sitting had no higher object behind it waiting to claim primacy. The physical endurance of the sitting was the work.
So the event is completely decoupled from the object.
When Hans Namuth filmed Pollock in 1950, that fascinating film did not replace Autumn Rhythm or Number 1A as the primary artwork. The physical painting remained absolutely sovereign.
But the performance art operates differently.
Consider a financial analogy to illustrate the profound difference between an unfolding event and a static representation. Think of a market flash crash.
A flash crash? Like when the stock market suddenly drops.
A sudden algorithmic plunge in the global stock market that lasts exactly 36 minutes and evaporates trillions of dollars is a dynamic, terrifying, real-time event.
It is pure panic.
If you are a trader on the floor watching the numbers plummet in real time, your heart rate spikes, you're sweating, you're experiencing the sheer panic of the moment. That 36-minute event reveals more about the underlying fragility of the economic system than spending years calmly looking at stable, static historical charts.
Because you are living through the volatility.
A happening, or Abramovic's durational performance, operates exactly like the live flash crash. It is an event unfolding in real time, subject to unpredictability, human emotion, and immediate risk.
Unlike a painting.
That is completely distinct from a static painting, which operates like the printed stock chart you look at 10 years later to reflect on past data. Performance art fundamentally changes what kind of thing art is. It substitutes fleeting temporality for physical permanence and living presence for pictorial form.
I believe we are arriving at a point where the historical mechanics become entirely clear, and our seemingly diametrically opposed positions can actually find common ground.
I think we are.
The historical tension between the permanent object and the fleeting event did not resolve by one side completely defeating the other in some sort of academic war. It resolves by permanently expanding the category of what art could be and how it could generate meaning for the audience.
I will concede a crucial point here. Cleanly agreeing to disagree on the strict origin while fully accepting the outcome. Abstract expressionism undeniably made embodied agency visible, narrative, and economically significant in a way it had never been in the history of Western art.
It opened the door.
To explicitly call Jackson Pollock a performance artist is, to my mind, still a massive retrospective distortion that erases the fundamental reality of the painted object. His absolute intent was to make a painting that would hang in a museum long after he was gone.
But his process changed how we see the painting.
Yes, I concede that his highly publicized, deeply athletic and physical process clearly and permanently taught the entire world to view the canvas differently. It taught the audience to read the finished, dry surface not just as a picture, but as a map, a physical trace of bodily action.
A cognitive shift.
It opened a cognitive door for the audience, even if Pollock himself did not personally walk all the way through it.
Taking that concession into account, we can look back at the complete historical arc we have traced today, from the pages of Life magazine to the atrium of MoMA, and articulate the final synthesis of this cultural shift. Long pause. The object stayed, but the meaning migrated toward performance.
That really captures it.
Both the triumphal narrative that painting seamlessly and inevitably evolved into performance art, and the rigid conservative defense that they share absolutely no conceptual DNA fall short of the truth. Abstract expressionism kept the artwork as a physical object, but the artist's bodily process became visible, celebrated, and highly marketable.
The process became part of the package.
The profound revolution we have been tracking today was not that painting magically became performance overnight in a Long Island barn. The true revolution was that art stopped needing an object to prove that something significant had happened. The event gained its own sovereign legitimacy.
This is the research desk officially signing off. In today's modern experience economy, where our daily social media presence and our curated digital personas are routinely monetized, are we all just performing the labor of our own lives, waiting for the audience to validate the invisible objects we create?